Revolution and War, Part 3. Today, there are more Cold Wars than wars. In the world that we know today, all the nations maintain a respectable front in the eyes of every other nation, and no one is prepared to openly contradict international public opinion. Everyone believes that force, violence, and war are detestable. All are opposed to aggression and hate aggressors. In this way, on the one hand, public opinion opposing and objecting to violence and war has evolved, but on the other hand, the leaders and political parties in different nations are just as desirous to further national interests as they were before the evolution of this public opinion. Even today, most of the nations are not prepared to consider the benefit or loss of another nation where their own interests are involved. Even today, they are prepared to achieve their objectives by hook or by crook, but at the same time, they do not want to lose their respectability in the eyes of the world. Hence, it is that in the world of today, we have cold wars instead of armed conflict. Propaganda in Cold War. Cold War is a psychological war. It is better described as a war of nerves. In it, one waits and sees which of the two contestants will crack first. Propaganda under the strain is the main weapon in a Cold War. Nations involved in Cold War resort to all such modes of propaganda as radio, newspaper, television, etc. Through the media of all kinds of propaganda, efforts are made to present one's own view as the correct one and to disprove and discredit the contentions of the other side. Delegates are sent to other countries, the objective of which is to propagate a viewpoint favorable to one's own country. Propaganda is a psychological medium of turning and molding public opinion according to predetermined objectives. As a result of propaganda, the public opinion changes. In direct propaganda, the people fail even to comprehend the objectives of the individuals directing the propaganda, while their opinions undergo change. A change in opinion influences beliefs, attitudes, etc. And it is while hidden behind these that the intelligent politician gains his ends. War and Cold War. As has been mentioned earlier, Cold War is a psychological war. In it, what is attacked is not the body of man, but his mind and his psychology. War endangers the very existence of human beings, whereas the Cold War does more to modify their thoughts and attitudes. War leads to destroy or defeat the opponent by the power of arms. In Cold War, the same objective is achieved through the medium of persuasion and the pressure of international public opinion, because in it, efforts are made to induce the people of the opponent nation to revolt against their own government. The result is that the control that the government has on its people is materially reduced. The people lose faith in their government and sometimes indulge in anti-government activities. Objectives of Cold War. The following are some of the objectives of Cold War. Defense and deterrence. Through the medium of Cold War, a country tries to protect itself from the deceptive and misleading propaganda of the opponent, and it is by the same methods that it can deter the activities of its opponent. Protection of ideology. The capitalist, communist, and democratic states initiate Cold Wars among themselves in order to protect their own ideologies and also to refute the views of the other philosophies. One of the main reasons behind the Cold War that continues between America and Russia is the protection of their respective ideologies. Persuading the public. In its psychological form, the Cold War is a means to persuade the public to accept one's own ideals. Through it, efforts are made to make the general public accept the ideals of the propagandist and forget the ideas of the opponent. Contradiction of the opposing government. In a Cold War, the opposition of government is constantly resisted and decried. Sometimes what is done is that a national of the opposing country is persuaded to work as a propagandist, and then through the medium of newspapers and radio, he is made to criticize his own government and country. When this individual recounts the injustices heaped by his government on his people, then it is natural that his words should appeal to his people. In this manner, the objectives of the people who initiated the Cold War are achieved. In this way, the capacity and power of the opponent is reduced by means of constant critical propaganda, and those parties in the enemy country are encouraged that will help to establish a government favorable towards the initiators of the Cold War. Helping a friendly government. Once a government that favors the propagandists has been established, then the propagandists turn their propaganda and Cold War against those who oppose this government. The aim behind this activity is to ensure the continued existence of the friendly government, since this ultimately benefits mutual trade, etc., for attainment of specific objectives. In much the same manner, a Cold War is sometimes intended to influence some government or nation or some political party, in such a manner that it will be induced to make some political or economic concessions in the form of trade monopoly or the permission to keep the army. Cold War often succeeds in attaining such objectives. Putting pressure against the enemy. Sometimes a Cold War is started with the express intention of dissuading some country from supporting the enemy and of persuading it to provide financial and military assistance against the enemy. In order to render this strategy effective, government in that particular country is forced and even coerced into accepting economic, military, or technical assistance. It is only natural that after this that nation will favor the initiators of the Cold War and will turn against its enemies. It is clearly evident from the description of the objectives of Cold War that in this, very often, the objectives are concealed and the initiators proceed on an essentially psychological basis. Why are there Cold Wars today instead of wars? The Cold Wars, the modern versions of the old-fashioned wars, are caused by the same factors that caused the wars in the olden days. In other words, the objectives for which wars are fought in the ancient times no longer necessitate those extreme measures for their achievement in the present context. Today, it is the Cold War that achieves those same objects. Why did this change occur? There are some very definite causes why this change did take place. They are as follows. Modern war is more expensive. In the modern era of science, war is an expensive affair because it is fought on land, in the air, as well as water, and it further involves the entire population of the country, not only its army. In the ancient days, the armies fought with each other while the people continued their leisurely ways unaffected by the clash. In a situation of war in the modern time, the entire economic organization of the country is forced to bear a very heavy burden which cannot be borne for a very long time. And irrespective of whether the country wins or loses in the war, its economic organization is completely disrupted and even shattered. The result is a fall in the standard of living and greater poverty. At the same time, the number of crimes in the country also increase. In this way, and because of the serious shock that it suffers, the economy is incapable of achieving the level of prosperity for a very long time. On the other hand, the economic condition of the people is not influenced during the progress of a Cold War. It is for this reason that Cold War has replaced wars. War does not bring victory of principles. As has been indicated at various stages earlier, one of the main aims of Cold War is the propagation of one's own ideology and the refutation of the other's principles. This end cannot be achieved through the medium of war. Arms cannot spread principles and ideologies because they are not things that can be forced on people. It is for the people to adopt them. Hence, for this, the most appropriate means is propaganda and not arms. The conflict that exists between the ideals of communism and democracy cannot be resolved by war and fighting. Hence, it is through the medium of psychological war that America and Russia are trying to gain victory for their respective ideologies. War threatens to annihilate the entire human race. In the days gone by, the wars were capable of wreaking only limited destruction in terms of individuals killed, and this number included only those directly involved in it. However, modern warfare is capable of devastating the entire human resources of the nations engaged in it, and it is even possible for one war to wipe the entire human race off the face of the earth. Since the discovery of atomic and nuclear energy and the invention of atomic weapons, the entire human race is threatened by the prospect of annihilation in the event of a war. Any war in which these media of mass destruction are employed will spell automatic disaster for humanity. Also, it is not only the present existing brand of humans that are threatened by destruction in this way, but also all the forthcoming generations. Some scientists hold the belief that if an atomic and nuclear war takes place, not a sign of life will be left on this earth. Hence, modern warfare is fatal not only to those who are participating in it, but also for those who are indifferent to the show of hostility and have nothing to do with it one way or the other. Any war at all can take on the form of a nuclear conflict at any time. This is one of the reasons why all kinds of armed conflict is assiduously avoided in the modern context, and its place is taken by Cold War. Improvement in the techniques of psychological warfare. In the modern world, any number of new techniques and methods of psychological warfare have been invented through the medium of which people situated over a large area can be effectively influenced. These techniques of psychological warfare are also available to all the nations, and hence, in the modern world, armed conflict has been replaced by psychological war, or what is known as a war of nerves. Victory through resistance. James Forrestal has written, "The surest way to avoid war is to make it clear to any possible group of enemies that the risks of engaging us are too great to make it worthwhile. In this way, victory over other nations can also be achieved through contradicting war and robbing them of their self-confidence. One good example of this method of avoiding war is continued testing of atomic weapons that is being indulged in at the moment by a number of nations. America, Britain, Russia, and some other leading countries almost momentously advertise their programs for the testing of atomic weapons so that the enemy should beware of their powers and should desist from any aggressive activity. Another method contradicting and avoiding warfare is to enter into a mutual defense treaty. At present, many of the powerful nations such as Russia, America, and England have entered into such contracts and treaties with many nations. The benefit derived from such an activity is that no one nation dares easily agitate any of the members of such a club. Process of Cold War. The process of Cold War is of a psychological nature. In his book, Sociological Aspects of Psychological Warfare, R. Sorensen has written, "The means of psychological warfare are its weapons, words and deeds are its ammunition, with the added consideration that words and circumstances under which they are conveyed often are viewed as deeds per in the target system." In this way, in the Cold War, words are used in many numerous ways which serve the purpose of propaganda, motive, threat, example, assurance, etc., as and when the circumstances warrant a particular use. The department most intimately related to and involved in the Cold War is that of foreign affairs. In few countries, some individual and private organizations also participate in this activity, and sometimes such activity is lavishly financed by the capitalist class of society. Means of using words in Cold War. As has been indicated earlier, the main weapon and means of the Cold War are the words. These words are put to use through the following media: broadcasting and relaying through radio or television, posters and paper cartoons that are dropped from aeroplanes or balloons or are sent through post, protest notes that are sent to the hostile government, debates in organizations of an international nature such as the United Nations Organization, covert diplomatic moves, declarations made by the government officials in the midst of the public or in press conferences or from the government benches in the parliament or in debates, propaganda through magazines, films, or newspapers. Methods of psychological warfare. The following methods are adopted in psychological warfare. Exhibition of power. Efforts are made to frighten and to overrate the other countries by exhibiting strength through atomic test, military rallies, and other comparable methods. Assistance. Another method of controlling other nations is to render to them economic, medical, political, technical, military, or other help. In this way, they are brought under the influence of the one who is rendering assistance, and they are at the same time persuaded to contradict its enemies. Discriminatory activity in trade. Attempts are made to intimidate or influence other nations by boycotting the goods produced by them for sale in the world market. The other aspect of this is controlling or influencing a nation through giving it bounties in the form of relaxation of the terms of trade agreements or rendering it assistance. Diplomatic relations. Pressure is brought on different countries by breaking off or resuming diplomatic relations with them. Cultural and commercial mixing or cooperation. Nowadays, another method that is adopted for increasing one's own sphere of influence is through sending cultural delegations of authors and painters and other artists to other countries and reciprocating by inviting similar delegations from them. Similarly, youth festivals and commercial fairs are organized and delegations from different nations are invited. This meeting and exchange strengthens the bonds between some people while it also serves to frighten other people. Laws relating to the return of immigrants. By means of these laws, some people are prevented from returning to their country while other people are granted permission to return. Control on communication with other countries. The means of communication are extensively utilized in any Cold War. Hence, communication with foreign countries is subjected to rigorous control and supervision. Newspapers and magazines are strictly censored. People who operate illegal transmitters are severely punished and immigration is controlled. Establishment of political parties in other countries. Sometimes political parties are created in other countries in order to oust the established government from power or to conduct campaigns of propaganda against it. If this is not feasible, then the help of some political party is secured. The communist countries encourage communist parties in non-communist countries and promote Cold War. Dear students, whatever we have learnt about the foregoing description of the techniques of Cold War or psychological war is not an exhaustive account. Almost unceasing efforts are directed towards this, and new experiments are made every day and new techniques are evolved. Although apparently a Cold War does not potentially possess all the dangers inherent in an armed conflict, yet it is quite as dangerous as the latter, and its consequences can be as violent as that of the latter. The fact is that Cold War can sometimes prove even more destructive than armed conflict, since it can pollute the thinking of an entire nation, while in an armed conflict only the soldiers are killed. Cold wars promote conditions of tension which continue over long periods. This leads to a disturbance and disruption of the normal system and organization of a country, and it also endangers international peace. Due to the very subtlety of the techniques of Cold War, they are even more difficult to control and counteract than the methods of an ordinary war. But nevertheless, it is quite as important to control them as it is to control those of ordinary warfare. Conclusion. War, be it cold or armed, is destructive to the human race, and the social psychologists can render great service in preventing and counteracting psychological war. In its fundamental form, a condition of international tension is of a psychological nature, although the function of relieving it is generally in the hands of politicians. The politicians have administrative power in their hands, and hence they can easily and smoothly implement their plans. Although the psychologist does not possess any such power, but being something in the nature of an expert on the scientific principles underlying human behavior in social conditions, the interactions of different groups and their individual influences, he is the most efficient man who can put forward suggestions for relieving social tensions. The problem of international tensions is fundamentally a psychologist's problem, and hence it is only the social psychologist who can analyze its nature and discover the factors inherent in it. It is social psychology that defines the causes of international tensions for us. In this way, the position of social psychologist is parallel to that of the therapist, or, in other words, he helps in resolving international tensions. However, the function of the social psychologist is not limited only to this. He not only discovers the causes of international tensions but also puts forward suggestions and plans for removing them. He also points out the difficulties that obstruct the process of eliminating international tensions and the way in which these